Hello, and welcome to Faking Engineering. I'm your host, Michael Kruger. Now on this show, we learn and utilize engineering concepts with no real prior knowledge or experience. If you've seen any of my previous videos, which chances are you probably haven't, I really need a new work table. The one I've been using is just a crappy old card table. It's got some thermal paste stains on it. It's definitely not great for YouTube. So I decided I wanted to build myself a brand new hardwood work table. I was planning on doing this alone, but I was talking to my dad about it and he actually expressed interest in working on it together. He's got a lot of experience working with wood, building and renovating houses, but he's never actually really built any furniture himself. He was just about to move back from North Carolina to Texas, where we're from. And I live in Virginia now, so he said, hey, if you can come down in the next couple weeks, we can work on this and then you can get it back to you in Virginia, since he's got a table saw, he's got a big garage, he's got everything we would need to build it. So I was like, absolutely, sure. And we made it happen. Unfortunately, he had to finish off some of the last stuff without me, but he didn't do the final sanding and staining and all that. He left that for me. And I did have to add some extra supports for the table base that I ordered. Speaking of, I got a nice pneumatic base for this. It's got a very high range of motion. As you can see, I'm obviously standing right now. It goes all the way down to like kindergartner table level. I'm loving this base. I'm loving everything. You're getting a bit of a preview of what's to come, but I really hope you enjoy this episode. I hope you learned something and have a great time. The first thing I needed to decide was what kind of wood I was going to use to build my table out of. My first inclination, and what I would probably still do if I had to redo this project, was to go to a local lumberyard and see what they had on sale. Since I was doing this last minute with my dad, we didn't really have time to go check out any lumberyards or anything like that. I had to decide on construction grade lumber from Home Depot to use. My first inclination was to use 2x4s, but as you can see, they're incredibly expensive. The most affordable out of them would be the poplar. That would probably really have a green tint. It wouldn't stain that well. It wouldn't have that look that I was going for. I mean, I would love to have some mahogany or walnut, but that was priced way out of my options. So my dad actually convinced me to stop looking at 2x4s and consider something a little less robust. My dad actually got me looking at 1x4s, and this is what I decided to build the table out of. These were actually priced about the same in North Carolina. These are a per foot price, and they came in nice 10-foot sections, which worked out really well for the 60-inch length that I was looking for overall, 5 feet. In other words, I could cut these boards essentially in half and put them together to get the length that I was looking for. So if you're not that used to working with lumber, you might think that 1x4 piece of wood that you're buying, it measures 1 inch by 4 inch. It makes sense. It's what it's labeled. But in reality, that is the nominal dimensions. The actual dimensions of that piece are 0.75 by 3.5. There is a reason for this. When the trees are freshly cut on site, they are actually 1 inch by 4 inch. But those pieces of wood are very wet and they need to be put into a kiln to dry it out. When that happens, the wood shrinks and warps slightly, so all pieces are then uniformly planed down to these new dimensions. Anytime you get a 2x4, it's actually 1.5 inch by 3.5 inch, and all other dimensions, you should double check what you actually need. I strongly recommend taking a look at a table of nominal versus actual wood dimensions. So I decided on the pneumatic base that I wanted to use pretty early on, and I looked at the manufacturer's spec sheet and I looked at their maximum dimensions that they supported. I looked at my room and figured out the optimal dimensions for my space. What I settled on was 5 feet by 2.5 feet. As I said earlier, the wood that I found came in 10-foot sections, which was perfect. I could cut each of them in half 5-foot sections. So that was taken care of. The 30-inch dimension, I divided by the 3.5 for each 1x4, and that came out to about 8.6 pieces of wood. So I didn't want to get 9 pieces. That would throw me into 5 long sections, and I would have more excess wood than I really needed, and I would end up over that 30-inch dimension, so I really didn't want to go any wider with it. So I just went with the 8 pieces, which, like I said, is really 4, and that came out to 28 inches wide. That was all well and good. I also purchased one more 10-foot piece of wood. That was to provide a coping around the edges of the table. This is to get rid of that really rough sort of edge that you get on planks of wood, and to also hide the seams of where we're joining them together. I'm gonna put it together with some nice 45, so it'll be a nice, really clean, finished look. It'll add a little bit of depth to the table, make it seem a little more heavy than it actually is, and it'll actually add a couple of inches dimension in both the X and Y. I think this is gonna end up looking really nice. The very first thing that I did was select the 4 straightest, nicest looking boards out of the 5 that I had pulled home. I did my best to pull all the nicest boards that I could, but it's obviously construction grade lumber. You're gonna have some warping. It was very hard to find even 5 pieces that were usable. I, again, strongly recommend go to a lumber yard. They're probably gonna have better stuff. Home Depot is not really the place to shop for furniture, but hey, I'm gonna make it work, right? So a tip for cutting any piece of wood in half is to not actually measure the entire length, just divide perfectly in half and make a mark from one side. You're usually going to end up with a miscut where one side is larger than the other, either due to a mismeasurement, a mistake, or even just the saw blade thickness not being accounted for in your cut. Anytime you're making a cut, the width of your saw blade is actually going to be subtracted completely from the wood that you're cutting. In this case, let's say we have a 10-foot 3/8 inch piece of wood. I could just divide that by 2, 5 3/16 and try and make a marking from one side, and that might get me pretty close, but it's not going to be that perfect. What I recommend doing is the following. Measure your piece to the closest, easiest to identify dimension. In this case, it would be 5 foot. Make that measurement on either side with your tape measure, go ahead and mark it, and then draw an arrow right in the middle of the two. Put that dead center on your saw blade, and I guarantee you're gonna end up with 2 pieces that are incredibly close in length. When setting your table saw blade height, make sure that you set it so that just the very top blade of the saw is over the piece of wood. Any higher, you're gonna lose efficiency and risk breaking the saw. Any lower, you might jam the saw, and you also risk breaking the saw. So be very careful about this every time you set up for a cut. It's very critical at this point that you decide how you want your pieces to go together. You really need to take into account the internal wood grain of the pieces that you're using, because they are going to influence how the structure behaves. You'll notice that at the end of each one, you're probably going to see some curved lines from the wood grain. That's because obviously trees grow with these rings every season, and they add on, and it's basically like a laminate that is has a lot of not centripetal but torsion forces towards the center of the radius that they were originally growing around. Anytime you have a piece of wood with, say, pieces of grain that are running like this, your wood is ultimately, over time, going to want to flex in that same direction. If you align all your boards like this, where they're all in the same orientation, your overall piece is probably going to end up warping to that same sort of shape over time. So what you want to do to avoid this is alternate your pieces. That should end up providing you with a good structural rigidity that keeps it very straight. The next thing that you're going to want to do is check the face of all the wood and make sure that the knots are where you want them, that you have the best side showing. It's really a lot of personal choices at this point. But once you get everything set how you want it, get all of your planks laid out, and then just using a pencil, something that you can erase or sand off, I like to make a big mark across it and then sort of circle diagonally down at each meeting piece of wood. This gives me a pretty good reference point, and I never really forget how they go back together. So after you've cut all of the pieces in half, before we move on to the next step, you're going to want to finish your edges. Most pieces of wood are going to have a bit of a bend in one direction or another. The bend also can occur as bowing along the long edge, but we're not as worried about that because once we get all of these plied together, they are going to even each other out. However, we definitely need them to be square on our X and Y axis, as if we're looking at the table down from above. So to do that, you're just going to want to set up your saw so that you have the thinnest possible material that you are removing from the side of your plank. You should have already chosen some relatively straight lumber and checked it before you started. This is just going to put a nice 90-degree edge on it. Once you've got all your boards selected and laid out how you intend for them to go into your final table, the next step is going to be to add some grooves. I am going for a tongue and groove system for my table. I've seen it used plenty of times in other furniture building, and it will add an extra level of rigidity to my piece beyond that of just gluing the planks together side by side. My dad actually has a dado set, and this one comes in a selection of, I believe it's between 1 and 4 blades that you can choose from, and by stacking them and offsetting them just slightly, what you basically end up doing is having like a super wide saw blade that will just chew material out of your lumber that you're putting through it. To achieve this, the first thing that we did was oriented the wood in 90 degrees so that it was perpendicular to the plane that we were cutting along. And you're going to want to line up that saw blade as perfectly dead center as you can. Now, our piece of wood is 0.75 inches wide. We managed to get a combination of dado blades that came out to about 0.25 inches. That's perfect. That means that I can take square cuts off of the groove and the tongue of equal amounts and come out with a nice square 0.25 inch tongue and grooves. Again, we're going to align that board right dead center on the saw blade and then run it through once. And as good as you measure and set up, you're going to end up just slightly off. So go ahead and flip that board around and run it again. This is going to give you a groove that is nice, dead center on that board. And it's going to be a little wider than what we anticipated, but that's perfect since we want just a little wiggle room between the tongue and groove. Nothing excessive, but we're going to need to be able to fit these together and get the glue in. Once we've got the groove done, we're going to move on to do the tongue. And I should note that we practiced our means and methods on some scrap cheap pine, some 1x4 that my dad had laying around from a previous project. Make sure that you always test with some scrap wood first, then move on to a small piece of the wood you intend to use, and then move on to make these cuts on the nice lumber that you've purchased so that you don't mess anything up. For the tongue, what we did was again a first pass and second pass, but this time we set the dado so that it was basically just under the height that we were looking for. We set the offset so that it was just less than we were looking for as well. And then we basically put it through a few times, made several measurements, staying very conservative the entire time, flipped the piece of wood, did the same thing, made some small adjustments based on test fits, continued to try them, fitting them together till they fit perfectly. And again, we were doing this with scrap wood. And then we moved on to start cutting a test groove again on our nice piece of oak. And once we had that all set, it was to the races, and we started cutting the grooves in all of the pieces. So once all these grooves were done, we went back to the table saw and reset it to cut the tongues. We had to cut another small piece of oak, and we used that to get the dimensions perfectly dialed in. After some trial and error, we finally got a perfect test fit, and we moved on to cut all the large pieces. At this point, it was time to start gluing all the boards together. We weren't able to just slap them all together like this. We actually had to do sort of 2 at a time and then join those 2 together. It takes forever. You gotta do at least 30 minutes per piece. We were honestly shooting for longer. It's not that easy either. You gotta be very careful with your clamps. You got to make sure that you're putting even pressure on them. We were using our test blocks that we had cut for the grooves and stuff as clamp blocks so that we weren't crunching down on the wood. Some of the pieces didn't really want to go together that well, so we had to go and run them back through the table saw and make sure that we were providing nice even pressure, more so than we were before. This was probably the hardest part of the process, was getting all the planks together, so I feel really bad that I had to leave during the middle of that, but again, it is one of the more time-consuming parts. Once we had all that together though, we did need to worry about a shim for the side that we had a groove but no tongue on. We could have cut this last one as a double tongue, but I would have lost some of the width on that board and I thought it would look weird in the final product. So instead we got some old pine that my dad had laying around and cut it down to 1/2 inch by 0.25 inch. This obviously isn't hardwood like the rest, but it's just there to provide a little extra structural rigidity. The glue around it is probably going to be stronger than the wood itself. Even though we didn't have all the pieces glued together, we got this piece cut before I left and we did a test fit, made sure that it was all good. Another thing that my dad had to do while I wasn't there was provide tongues on both of the outer edges that were still flat. He basically just, once all the planks were glued together and nice and solid, he just ran it through to cut a tongue like we did previously, did test fits, made sure that everything was good together, and then moved on to the next step. My dad took the last 1x4 and split it in half, essentially making two 1x2s. He took both of those pieces and 1/4 inch away from the edge, he provided a 1/4 inch deep groove, just like we did on the main planks in the body of the table. Now, these pieces then got measured and cut with 45-degree angles on the end so that they would slide on as a nice coping for the edge of the table. And this is what the end product came out to be. This is what you'll see in a moment in the pictures whenever I start sanding and staining it. But I mean, it turned out really, really great. I was mentioning before that some of the wood could tend to bow up and down in this Z axis right here, but luckily the planks being side by side with different curvatures to them sort of helps cancel each other out. And then these coping pieces add just a really strong frame to the entire thing that keeps it very nice and straight. I will note that I believe my dad took extra care in finishing the edges on these to make sure that they were as straight as possible. I almost forgot. My dad did one last thing for me before he returned the table. I don't have a power sander, like a hand power sander, so he went ahead and used his to finish off the whole surface of the table to make sure that it was nice and flush. It wasn't the smoothest sand, it was still a pretty rough sand, but it was nice and level. So where the coping met the table, where the planks met each other, everything came out to be nice and smooth. Okay, so I finally got my table back from my dad's and he went ahead and finished up most of it. The bottom is pretty well unsanded, or at least the way he gave it to me. I gave it a bit of a sanding, get rid of the rough stuff, but I'm not too worried about perfectly leveling this side. The other side, he used his power sander on. It's very nice, very level. It did get some water stains on it on the drive back here. I had a cooler on it that I didn't realize was leaking a bit, and I got most of that sanded out, but you'll see whenever I flip it over, I think it still needs a little bit of work. Right now, however, I need to get the mounting pieces for the table. This is just the tabletop. I don't really want to mount my base right onto it. I want to have like an intermediary. Part of that is I don't want to have this weird hanging look going on. I would like it to be nice and flush. I went ahead and got some pretty cheap, I think it's pine, but it's a 1x3. It should fit in nicely in there with it's still a bit of a lip, but not bad. Enough to cover up the mounting hardware. It'll actually be one on this side and then one on the other. So I'm gonna go ahead, find these straight sections that I can, cut it up, put it in there, glue it, clamp it. I'm gonna use the disc sander to get the ends nice and 90. I might use the belt sander to take off a larger portion before I square it off. When you're gluing these up, you don't need to be too excessive. Just make sure that you have enough of a bead that whenever it compresses, it'll fill out everything. I literally just bought more clamps just for this job. I actually complained in another video that'll probably come after this one that I don't have enough clamps. And I still don't think I have enough because I was thinking 2 would cut it for each, but it's bowing up enough in the middle that I really need a third. Got these 2 left for the other side. Also, I got these small ones. I don't really think they'll do much, but I can try. Yeah, that doesn't really do crap. My other one has been sitting for at least 30 minutes, but I was really looking for a 24-hour on that. Shoot. Well, this one just needs to be 30 minutes. So I guess I'll go ahead and do one side and wait and do the other. Just clamp it to hell because there is some bending going on here. It's not perfectly straight. Obviously the other side is nice and straight because of the sanding to even it out. But on this side, the boards aren't quite there. I'm gonna go ahead and throw all these clamps on here. Well, while I'm waiting on that to dry, I will go ahead and tell you that the next step is going to be staining and then applying a protective polyurethane coat to the table. The stain that I got was probably gonna need I'm guessing it's gonna need 2 coats. I'm hoping it only needs 1, but it'll probably need 2 coats. I got a nice natural stain. The table already has a really nice wood grain as it is, so I'd rather bring that out rather than hide it with something else. I also went ahead and got some plastic wood. It's gonna go on before the staining. There are some gaps. There's one small stress crack, but I'm actually more concerned about a large gap between 2 planks down the center. I'm gonna go ahead and get that filled up. This is again is a natural color. It should stain well. It'll sand everything. It'll be just fine. Actually, I just realized one of the areas that I definitely need this is at the corners. One of them joins really well. The others have a bit of a gap. So I can go ahead and do that now before I flip the table back over later. I'm just applying this to my finger and then pressing it into the holes. Don't worry too much about getting it on the surrounding areas because you can wipe it off pretty easily while it's still wet, and then obviously it will sand down. So as long as you keep it nice and thin, you won't see any effects once you sand it. All right, by the time I get all this crap washed off my hands, that should probably be dry and ready to move on to the next one. All right, it's been 30 minutes and luckily the plastic wood came off my fingers pretty easily. It just took a little bit of hot water and maybe the outer layer of skin. Not too bad. Let's go ahead and remove the clamps, get this one glued up to the other side. Let that sit for another 30 minutes and then we'll flip it over, get the last of the plastic wood in there, wait a few minutes. I think it's just 15 on that. Yeah, just 15 minutes and then go ahead and put the first coat of stain on. So while this has been drying, I decided to go upstairs and take a look at the manual for the new table base that I got, and I'm really glad that I did because I screwed up a bit, guys. They say that you need to maintain 200 millimeters at least between the legs and the end of the table. 200 millimeters is about 8 inches, and I definitely didn't do that. They're right on the edge. And then the other big thing that I was looking at is that here on the back, it actually gives the dimensions. We're basically maxed out right in between those two at about 45 inches. I was sitting there really confused because this is supposed to accommodate 60-inch tabletops, but of course the math makes sense. You put about 8 inches on either side of the maximum length and it can accommodate a 60-inch tabletop. So what I'm gonna have to do is cut up the remainder of this wood, the less desirable pieces, and put those where I've marked those dimensions to be, to basically get the maximum spread just under it, but still maintain 8 inches from the edge of our tabletop. I am going to cut this right in half. It's going to be just over enough to accommodate the table legs, so I'm lucky that I have enough left. And I mean, I'm not too torn up about these ones right here, because if anything, they're just going to provide a little more structural integrity. I mean, there's a little more weight, but it's pretty lightweight pine wood. It's not like the hard oak that I'm using for the rest. So let's get to it. One thing that I did was I measured this piece from each end and it was just over 45 inches. So what I did was I marked 25.5 measuring from each side, and that gave me a perfect spot to put my blade right in between. So I should get a nice equal 22.5 inches from either piece of wood. I mean, this is a skill saw, so we'll see how it goes. The power did just go out at my apartment, and I think they're switching between phases right now, so hopefully my power tools all work correctly. It's taking a while to warm up. Oh, that is not getting the juice it needs. I just stopped the sander with this piece of wood. Let's do this the old-fashioned way. All right, I think if I bring another keg over to support it on either side, I can get a little creative with the clamps and get all of this done at once and weight down the other parts with maybe some of those pony kegs. All right, that should do it. The connection pieces are firmly glued on. I flipped it over and I set it up on top of this tarp. I mean, this is a garage floor, but I still would rather not get it stained. Next up is going to be using the wood filler, and you can actually see the line right here where the big, it's not a split, it's a gap between two planks. There's a bit of a stress split right down on this end, and there's a couple more little gaps just all around that I want to fill in. I might try and use a paper towel instead of my finger this time, not lose any more skin. We'll go on to that. You will notice right here that there's a discoloration, and this is what I was talking about. It was a much larger spot from the water, but I've been sanding down at it, and that dark nastiness goes away really quickly whenever I sand at it. But I don't know, I'm not that much of an expert with wood by any means. It keeps coming back though later on. Like, it'll be sort of all right like that, and then I'll come back an hour later and the stain will seem to reappear. So I probably just need to get in there even deeper at it, but I'll probably try and do that while I'm waiting on the plastic wood to set. I think that is all the gaps and holes. You can already see that that stain is starting to come and lift again. I really don't know what's going on with that. It gets a little better every time I sand it, so hopefully I don't end up with a divot right there from how much I need to sand it to get it to go away. I'm gonna let this sit for about 15 minutes, clean off my hands, and then get this all smoothed out. All right, get this thing sanded. My main concern is to stick with the joining lines between the planks because that's pretty much where all of the plastic wood is. It actually already looks like there's some areas where it sank in or didn't completely get it covered, so I might have to do a second coat. I'll do that second coat while I'm trying to work this out. Don't put wet things on untreated wood. It just keeps coming right back up. I don't know. All right, drink some beer, stain this thing, sand off that second coat. I forget what grit the sandpaper is, but it's really smooth. It's probably not the smoothest you can get, but it's a nice middle ground for most work. This is gonna feel exceptionally smooth once we get the polyurethane on there. You wanna get your wood as clean as possible before you stain it. Get all of the wood chips and sawdust and just everything off of it. I'm doing everything by hand right now, and then I'm gonna come back in a second more aggressively with the compressed air. So for the stain, I decided on a classic oil-based. The water-based, you can get away with, I'm not a big fan of it. Let's just put it at that. I like the oil-based. It's the good old-fashioned stuff that people have been using time in memoriam. This one's a nice natural finish. I don't really want to mess this wood up at all. I picked a really nice oak. Granted, it was 2x4s, but it looks really good as is. I just want to bring out its natural characteristics a little bit more. I did not get the 2-in-1 polyurethane and stain. I know that they exist, and I was considering it, but personally I think that it would be better suited just to do a couple coats of this and then a nice spray of, I did get the special polyurethane, the kind that 3 coats is equal to 1, so I did splurge a little bit, but let's get going. You can use a lint-free cloth. I've seen people use sponges, all sorts of implements. I do like a brush. Make sure that you get a brush that matches the stain that you're using. This brand, for instance, had some for oil-based and some for water-based, so make sure you pick the correct implement. I'm just gonna go over this pretty lightly. I'm not gonna try and put too much in. You'll see my technique. Now I'm going to gently use this lint-free towel to remove any excess. The sides are pretty fine because they can drip down. It's the top that it tends to pull a little bit. And finally, I'll hit it with the still damp brush one more time just to make sure that the finish looks good. Now I can put another coat on this in 2 hours. It is getting pretty late. I might do it tonight, I might not. That should be good for now though. The first coat of stain has finished drying nicely. Let's get going on the second. Now at this point, I am keeping the brush with just the very tip wet, just trying to even everything out. And honestly, if I can get away with not using the towel on this round, I think I'm gonna go for it. It's a nice, light, even coating. And the towel will definitely mess up your finish no matter how good your towel is or how good you do it. I tripped, but I did not hit the table, and that's all that matters. You may or may not know, whenever you're staining wood, that whenever it's wet, it's always going to be a little bit darker than what the finished product ends up looking like. I really like this tone right now. It actually might be a little dark, so it might come down right to where I want it, but you know, depending on what it looks like after this coat dries, I may or may not decide to do a third coat. I'm really liking the stain. I'm really liking the natural characteristics it's bringing out of the wood, and I'm really happy with the wood filler. It's really not showing at all. It looks like it's just a part of the natural wood grain, if anything. On to the next coat, either another coat of this or onto the polyurethane, one of the two. It's the next day, the second coat of stain has dried and it looks really, really good. I thought about doing a third coat, but honestly, I don't want it to be any darker. I want to keep a nice, light, natural look to it. So now I've pulled it out of the garage and I am going to get started on the polyurethane coat. I'm not going to film this part because I don't want my phone camera to be anywhere near this stuff. It would be hell to get it cleaned off. So I will show you the final product once I'm all done. I finished coating this in polyurethane, and before I even got started, the can that I got didn't work. It was clogged and I didn't have any mineral spirits or anything to clear it out, so I went back up to Home Depot to swap it out. One thing I realized is I had accidentally gotten the clear matte before. I meant to get satin, so I was able to get the one that I needed. That was a happy little accident. Otherwise though, the coating is all done. It's looking really good. You can still see how wet it is right now. I'm gonna wait at least an hour for it to dry and then check it out. Maybe do another coat. I've still got a bit left in here. Other than that, I think it looks pretty good. I'll probably have to wait a little longer, more like 8 hours, something like that, to get the base mounted on. I don't want it to be tacky while I take it upstairs and put it on the carpet. So we'll see. The first coat of polyurethane is nice and dry. I've decided I'm gonna go ahead and do a second coat just because this is gonna be a work table. It's looking really, really, really good. Once the second coat was as dry as I was willing to wait for it, I brought the table up and put it on a clean sheet to work on. I also unboxed my pneumatic base that I got from Monoprice, and let me tell you, it was a great deal. I just got a little single motor one, not the most robust, but perfect for my needs. You can also see that woodworking does definitely go back in my family. My grandfather made this table years ago. The legs are starting to get a little shaky though, so I'm probably going to come back and try and fix those later. I'm not going to sit here and explain how a pneumatic base works. I'm just going to go ahead and let you enjoy some time lapse of me installing it. So right here, I realized that the table actually had 2 more mount points that I didn't take into account. I thought about it for a moment and decided that I could probably just cut another piece of scrap wood and glue it onto the table for some more support. is done. I think it turned out really nicely. I went ahead and finished up the cable management as best as I could. I've got a line running from the control over here, and it goes down and along, and then we've got our power brick over here. I went ahead and bundled that up, and then I mounted a power strip right here using command strips, and it's really awesome. I just flip this switch right here and the whole table turns on and off. Also, I put another power strip along the bottom, and that feeds my 2 lights and the power that normally serves my camera over there. So whenever I flip that switch, those turn on, and whenever I flip it off, they just all turn back off. It's really awesome. I went ahead and also mounted the remote for those lights under the side here for easy access. Oh man, I am really happy with how this turned out. This thing has a great range of motion. It's not particularly fast, but you know, it's fast enough. I can't tell y'all how happy I am with how this turned out. You know, big shout out to my dad. I learned a lot on this project, and wow. I am so happy with how this table turned out. It really completely exceeded my expectations. I really got to thank my dad. He helped so much. He taught me so much. I really hope that this project inspires you to try and go build something yourself, maybe a table, maybe something else. I really hope you learned something. As always, I know I did. And again, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe. I've got more fun projects. Obviously this is gonna be my next video. It's a catapult of sorts. There's a lot more going into it than what you currently see. So hopefully I can get this project finished up pretty soon and get that video out for y'all. Again, thank you so much, and y'all have a great day.